The night was heavy with tension, though no one in the compound dared to voice it aloud. The command had been clear: she was to stand down, to step aside, to allow others to handle what they thought was beyond her reach. But orders like that had never settled well with her, not when the people who gave them looked at her as though she were a fragile tool, a weapon to be sheathed until convenient. Her name was Rhea, and though she had spent years in the shadows of men who claimed to lead, tonight she would become something far greater, for the silence before the storm carried a promise, and she intended to break it with her own two hands. When she first entered the training grounds years ago, they mocked her size, her quietness, her refusal to show fear. But Rhea had never needed the clamor of words to prove her worth. She listened, watched, studied every movement, every flaw, and built her strength not in the boasts of her peers but in the patient hours where no one watched her climb ropes until her palms bled, strike wooden dummies until her knuckles split, run through drills until her lungs screamed. Those who dismissed her had forgotten that silence can hide a fire, and now that fire burned too hot to contain. The mission tonight was supposed to be clean: intercept a convoy of mercenaries who had been terrorizing border villages, capture their leader, and cut off the supply chain that had fueled months of bloodshed. The men in charge gathered in their tents and drew maps, but when it came time to assign the strike team, they hesitated to include her. "Stand down," the commander had told her, his voice carrying that condescension she had known too long. "This isn't your fight." She said nothing, but her jaw tightened, and in that silence she made a promise. If they would not let her prove herself, she would take the chance anyway. The attack began before dawn, the horizon still painted with the faint embers of night. The convoy moved swiftly through the ravine, armored vehicles grinding over rock and dust. The official strike team was still maneuvering into position when Rhea slipped away from camp. Alone, unarmed, she descended into the ravine's shadows with only her body as her weapon. The mercenaries laughed when they saw her step out into their path, a lone figure blocking steel and firepower. Their leader sneered, barking something in a language she did not care to understand, and waved his men forward. They expected her to flee, perhaps to beg, perhaps to die quickly. Instead she surged forward, every muscle honed by years of doubt and denial exploding into motion. The first man swung a rifle toward her chest, but before his finger touched the trigger she had twisted under the barrel, driving her elbow into his ribs with such force that he dropped gasping to the ground. She wrenched the weapon free and flung it aside, refusing the comfort of metal. Tonight it would be her hands, her will, nothing else. Another mercenary lunged at her with a knife, but she caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted, and slammed his head against the armored truck. Bone cracked. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Panic flickered in the others. This was not how battles were supposed to unfold, not how a lone woman was supposed to stand against armed men. Their disbelief became her strength, for hesitation was a fatal weakness. She struck like a storm, spinning, striking, each motion a memory of every insult she had swallowed, every dismissal she had endured. Boots hammered into skulls, fists shattered jaws, knees broke ribs. They fell one by one, a chorus of groans and screams echoing off the ravine walls. By the time the dust settled, a ring of unconscious men surrounded her, their weapons scattered, their pride broken. Only the leader remained, his sneer replaced by something closer to fear. He drew a pistol, hands trembling, and aimed at her chest. "Stand down," he spat, mocking the word she had heard too many times before. Her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Without a sound she moved. The gun fired, the shot cracking like thunder, but she was already inside his guard, her hand snapping his wrist aside so the bullet vanished into the dawn. Her palm struck his throat, her knee drove into his stomach, and the mighty leader who had burned villages with impunity now lay writhing at her feet, choking on dust and terror. She stood over him, breathing hard but unbroken, her hair wild, her fists still clenched. Behind her, the official strike team finally arrived, their eyes wide with disbelief at the battlefield she had carved alone. None of them spoke. They could only stare at the woman who had disobeyed their orders and in doing so had done what none of them could. She did not wait for their praise, nor did she need it. She simply stepped past them, her eyes on the horizon, knowing the fight was far from over but certain now that nothing in this world could silence her again. The silence that followed was heavier than the echoes of battle, and though her body ached with the strain of every blow, Rhea walked forward with the calm of someone who had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The soldiers who had been sent on the official strike team looked at one another uneasily, some ashamed, others awed, but none of them dared to speak. The commander himself, who had barked at her to stand down, finally stepped forward, his eyes hard but his voice uncertain. "You were ordered to stay back," he said, as though trying to grasp at authority he no longer possessed. She turned to him slowly, her face streaked with sweat and dust, and in her silence there was a defiance that pierced deeper than any words. The commander felt it and looked away first, and in that moment she knew the tide had shifted. She was no longer a shadow. Word of what had happened spread quickly. By the time the prisoners were bound and the convoy secured, whispers had grown into stories, and stories into something close to legend. A lone woman had taken down a squad of mercenaries with nothing but her bare hands. Some embellished, claiming she fought with the strength of 10 men, others insisted she had moved faster than the eye could follow. Rhea herself cared for none of it. She had not fought for their admiration. She had fought because she had been denied the right to fight, and because something in her blood refused to bow. Still, as the days passed and they marched back toward their base, she could feel the eyes on her, the shifting of respect where once there had been dismissal. It was not a crown she sought, but it was a burden that now clung to her shoulders nonetheless. At night, when the fires burned low, she sat apart from the others, her thoughts restless. She remembered the faces of the men she had struck down, the fear in their eyes, the sudden silence when bodies hit the ground. Victory carried its own weight, heavier than she had expected. She knew they had been killers, raiders who had left innocent blood in their wake, but the memory of breaking them with her own hands haunted her dreams. Yet each time she tried to push the doubt away, the same words returned to her: "Stand down." That phrase had been a chain around her neck for too long, and even if the cost was blood, she would never wear it again. Back at the main encampment, reports of her actions reached higher command. She was summoned, not by the man who had told her to stay behind, but by generals who rarely acknowledged foot soldiers at all. In the vast tent lined with maps and guarded by stern-faced officers, she stood alone before them, her shoulders squared though her heart raced. They asked her questions, sharp and probing. Why had she disobeyed? How had she managed such a feat without weapons? Did she understand the risk she had taken? She answered each calmly, truthfully, never flinching. "I disobeyed," she admitted, "because waiting would have cost lives. I fought because someone had to. I survived because I trained for the day when no one believed I could." The generals exchanged glances, some skeptical, some impressed. At last, one leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You proved yourself. But know this, strength will make you enemies as well as allies. Are you prepared for that?" She met his gaze steadily and nodded. "I have been prepared all my life." With that, the tone shifted. Where once she had been overlooked, now they spoke of her as a weapon to be honed, a soldier to be deployed in missions where others might falter. She was given more freedom, more responsibility, and with it, more danger. Yet she accepted it without hesitation, for what use was strength if it was not tested? The following weeks thrust her into conflicts fiercer than any she had known. Ambushes in the dead of night, sieges against fortified compounds, infiltration into enemy camps. Each time they sent her, each time she returned, scarred but unbroken. Word spread beyond their borders until even her enemies knew the name Rhea. Some called her a phantom, others a demon, but those who fought beside her knew better. She was a woman who had refused to yield, and in doing so had carved herself into something unstoppable. Yet for all the victories she felt the weight of isolation grow heavier. Respect was not the same as trust, admiration was not the same as belonging. Around campfires, men still hesitated to speak freely in her presence. Commanders praised her but kept their distance, uncertain how to handle someone who did not fit into the roles they had long accepted. Rhea bore it in silence, but deep inside she felt the ache of a loneliness sharper than any blade. It was during one such mission, when she and her unit were pinned down by enemy fire in the ruins of a village, that the truth of her resolve was tested once more. Bullets tore through the crumbling walls around them, soldiers shouted in panic, and the commander of the unit froze, unable to give orders. For a moment, chaos threatened to consume them. Then Rhea stepped forward, her voice clear, cutting through the noise like steel. "Follow me," she said, and though some hesitated, most obeyed, for they had seen what she was capable of. She charged into the storm, weaving between shattered walls, striking down foes with precision and fury, rallying those behind her until the tide turned and the village was theirs. When it was over, bloodied but alive, the men looked to her not just with respect but with something closer to loyalty. For the first time she felt the shift, not merely a weapon, not merely a legend, but a leader. And though she had not sought that role, she knew she could not turn from it now. The days bled into nights and the battles blurred together, yet through it all Rhea moved with a certainty that unnerved both friend and foe. She had grown beyond the role of a soldier who merely followed orders. she had become the force others depended on when chaos threatened to unravel them. The generals who once questioned her now dispatched her as the spearhead of operations, and though her body carried scars and her mind carried ghosts, she refused to yield. Each fight hardened her further, not into stone but into tempered steel, unbreakable yet sharpened by fire. Still, with each victory, a shadow followed her, whispering doubts she could not silence. Was she becoming the very thing she fought against, a creature of violence who only knew how to strike, to kill, to conquer? At night, when the stars stretched endlessly above, she remembered the girl she had once been, mocked and overlooked, yearning only for the chance to prove herself. That girl had not imagined becoming a figure of fear. She had only wanted to be seen. Now she was seen by all, yet known by none. It was in this storm of questions that her next trial began. Intelligence arrived of a warlord who had risen in the east, gathering mercenaries and deserters under his banner, carving a path of fire through the countryside. Villages burned, families vanished, and even seasoned soldiers whispered his name with unease. The generals debated strategies for days, yet none seemed willing to confront him directly. Too dangerous, too unpredictable, too costly. But Rhea, listening in silence, felt the decision crystallize within her. She would go. Not with an army, not with fanfare, but as she had always done, alone if she must. The commander she once served confronted her when he heard of her plan. His face was worn, his voice quieter now, no longer filled with the arrogance it once carried. "You've proved enough," he said, almost pleading. "Don't throw yourself into this. Stand down." The words stung, not with anger but with the weight of memory. Once those words had been a dismissal, a chain. Now they sounded like concern, perhaps even fear of losing her. For a moment she wavered, but then she shook her head. "If I don't face him, who will? If we wait, more innocents will die." The commander closed his eyes, and when he opened them he said nothing more. She left that night. The journey east was long and treacherous, through forests where the air smelled of ash, across rivers stained with smoke, past villages reduced to husks. She saw the aftermath of cruelty, bodies left unburied, homes charred black, the silence of death hanging heavy in the air. Each step hardened her resolve. She would not let this warlord's reign continue. When she reached the outskirts of his camp, she saw it was no mere gathering of raiders but a fortress of chaos. Hundreds of men moved within, armed and restless, their banners painted with blood. Fires lit the night sky, drums echoed in the distance, and at the center of it all stood the warlord's great tent. She watched from the shadows, her heartbeat steady, her breath calm. She could not storm such a place by force, not even with all her skill. But she did not need to. She waited, patient as the moon moved across the sky, until at last the warlord emerged, surrounded by guards, his laughter booming like thunder. He was a giant of a man, scars crisscrossing his skin, his eyes burning with cruelty. He feasted on fear, and his men adored him for it. To challenge him openly would mean death, but Rhea had no intention of dying. She stepped from the shadows, her figure illuminated by the firelight. Gasps rippled through the camp as soldiers recognized her, for her reputation had traveled farther than she had. "The woman who fights with her bare hands," one muttered. "The demon of the ravine," another whispered. The warlord's laughter boomed again when he saw her. "So this is the ghost they speak of," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You come alone, little warrior? Do you think to end me with your fists?" She said nothing. Her silence was her weapon, and it unsettled him more than any insult. With a growl he waved his guards aside. "No blades," he commanded. "She wants to fight with hands, so let it be. I'll crush her in front of all of you." The circle formed quickly, soldiers eager to see the legend shattered. They shouted, jeered, but Rhea heard none of it. Her eyes were locked on the warlord, her body loose yet coiled, ready to strike. He lunged first, his massive arms swinging with the force of a hammer. She dodged, the wind of his strike brushing her cheek, and drove her fist into his ribs. He staggered but did not fall, his grin widening. "Good," he said. "Fight me." Blow after blow thundered between them, the ground trembling beneath their struggle. His strength was monstrous, each strike capable of breaking bones, but she was faster, sharper, weaving around him like smoke, landing strikes that chipped away at his endurance. The crowd roared with every clash, their bloodlust feeding the night. Minutes stretched into eternity, sweat stinging her eyes, her muscles screaming, but she did not falter. This was more than a fight, it was a test of everything she had endured, every scar, every moment of doubt. And slowly, surely the giant began to slow. His swings grew sluggish, his breath ragged. She seized the opening, striking with a flurry of blows, ribs, throat, jaw, each one precise, each one carrying the weight of her defiance. At last he collapsed, his body crashing into the dust, the silence that followed louder than any cheer. Rhea stood over him, chest heaving, her fists trembling not from weakness but from triumph. Around her hundreds of eyes stared, stunned into silence. The warlord was broken and she remained unbowed. For a moment the camp was frozen, every man caught between disbelief and fear, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath them. The warlord lay groaning in the dust, his once towering presence reduced to a broken heap, and the woman who had stood alone against him remained upright, her shadow stretching long in the firelight. Rhea's chest rose and fell with steady breath, her eyes sweeping over the ring of soldiers who surrounded her. They were armed, they were many, but none dared to move. The stories they had heard of her were no longer whispers, they were truth. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her back on the fallen warlord and walked away from him as though he no longer mattered. The defiance of that act, the calm dismissal of a man they had once worshipped, cut deeper than any blade. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder, shifting from fear to something like awe. Some spat curses under their breath, but others looked at her with reluctant respect. She had done what none of them dared to do. The warlord, choking on rage, tried to push himself up, but his body betrayed him. He collapsed again, clutching his chest where her strikes had shattered his strength. With a hoarse cry, he shouted for his men to kill her, but his command fell flat. None moved. A leader who could be defeated was no leader at all, and they had just seen their titan laid low by a woman who carried no weapon but her own resolve. Rhea did not wait to see what choice they would make. She stepped past the boundary of the circle, her stride unhurried, her presence still radiating power. In her silence there was no fear, only certainty, and that certainty infected the hearts of those who watched. By the time she disappeared into the darkness beyond the fires, the camp was no longer unified. Factions splintered, some loyal to the warlord, others whispering that perhaps the woman was the stronger force to follow. His empire had cracked in a single night. Rhea moved swiftly into the wilds, every muscle screaming from the battle, her knuckles raw, her ribs bruised, but she pressed on until the sounds of the enemy camp faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to collapse beneath the shelter of a twisted tree, gasping for air, her body trembling. Pain washed over her in waves, but beneath it was the quiet hum of triumph. She had faced a monster and she had not broken. Yet as the adrenaline faded, another weight pressed down on her. What now? She had not gone to that camp to claim power, nor to take command of the soldiers who had followed the warlord. She had gone to end the threat, to prove that no tyrant could stand unchallenged. But by striking him down she had left a void, and voids in war were dangerous things. Armies without leaders splintered into chaos, and chaos consumed the innocent first. She sat beneath the tree, blood drying on her hands, and wondered if she had unleashed something she could not control. Dawn came pale and cold, and with it the sound of footsteps. Rhea rose slowly, preparing for another fight, but what emerged from the trees were not enemies but villagers. Men and women, thin from hunger, their clothes torn, their eyes wide with cautious hope. They had followed her trail after hearing the uproar from the warlord's camp, daring to believe that perhaps their tormentor had fallen. When they saw her battered but alive, the truth settled on their faces like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They knelt before her, not in worship but in gratitude. She felt the weight of their gaze, the desperate belief that she was something more than human, something sent to deliver them. Rhea wanted to tell them she was no savior, only a woman who refused to bow, but the words caught in her throat. These people had lost everything, families, homes, dignity, and now they clung to her as proof that their suffering was not endless. She did not push them away. Instead, she helped them rise one by one, and listened as they spoke of what they had endured. Their voices trembled with grief, but also with a fragile hope that perhaps at last the tide was turning. In that moment she understood something she had never sought. She was more than a fighter now. She was a symbol, and symbols carried responsibilities heavier than any weapon. She could not walk away from this. If she did, the warlord's men would regroup, another tyrant would rise, and the people would suffer once more. She had shattered a pillar of cruelty, but to leave the ruins unguarded was to invite ruin again. The realization was bitter and heavy, but she accepted it. She would not abandon them. In the weeks that followed, Rhea found herself at the heart of something unexpected. The villagers spread word of her victory and more people came. Refugees, farmers, even deserters from the warlord's army who no longer wished to fight under his broken banner. They gathered not because she called them but because they believed in her. Against her will, she had become a leader, not of soldiers bound by orders but of people bound by hope. She trained them not with weapons alone but with courage, teaching them to defend their homes, to stand together, to believe that they were not powerless. Each night she lay awake, staring at the stars, wondering how she had come to this path. She had set out to prove herself, to silence those who told her to stand down, but now she bore the weight of lives that looked to her for salvation. It frightened her more than any enemy she had faced, but it also lit a fire in her chest. For the first time she was not fighting only for herself. She was fighting for them. The ragged group that had gathered around Rhea grew larger with each passing day, transforming from a scattering of desperate survivors into a fledgling community bound together by the fragile threads of hope. She never sought to lead them, but leadership clung to her regardless, not from speeches or promises but from action. When food was scarce, she was the first to go into the wild to hunt or forage. When raiders threatened, she stood at the front to repel them. When despair weighed on their hearts, she fought to show them strength, not with empty words but with the unshakable certainty of her presence. The people began to see her not just as a fighter but as a guardian, and though the burden pressed down on her shoulders, she bore it without complaint. Still shadows loomed. The warlord she had defeated had not died that night. Broken and humiliated, he had been carried away by his loyalists, and though his body was shattered, his hunger for vengeance was not. Rumors drifted to her camp that he was gathering strength again, drawing in mercenaries who sought the bounty he promised for the woman who had shamed him. Rhea knew it was only a matter of time before he returned, and this time he would not underestimate her. She could have fled, disappearing into the wilderness as she had before, but she no longer had that luxury. Too many lives were tied to her now, too many eyes watched her for guidance. If she left, they would be left to the mercy of a man who knew no mercy. She steeled herself for what was coming, even as doubt whispered in her ear at night, asking how long she could stand against the tide alone. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she gathered those willing to fight and began their training. Many were farmers, shepherds, laborers who had never lifted a weapon in anger. Their hands shook, their bodies faltered, but she saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire that had burned in her own heart when no one believed in her. Patiently she taught them what she knew, how to stand firm, how to strike, how to endure pain without breaking. She pushed them hard, not out of cruelty but because she knew their enemies would show none. And slowly, day by day, they began to change. Where once there was only fear, there grew resilience. Where once there was weakness, there grew strength. Watching them, she felt something stir within her that she had not known in years: pride. Yet she also knew that training alone would not be enough. The warlord had numbers, weapons, resources. If they met him in open battle, they would be crushed. So she taught them to fight differently, to move like shadows, to strike quickly and vanish before the enemy could respond. She led them in small raids against outposts and supply lines, each victory feeding their courage and chipping away at the warlord's power. The people began to believe not only in her but in themselves, and that belief was more dangerous to their enemy than any blade. Still, the warlord did not remain idle. Scouts reported his forces growing larger, his camps swelling with mercenaries drawn by greed and vengeance. His hatred for Rhea was a fire that consumed him, and he would not rest until she was destroyed. When word reached her that he had begun marching west with his new army, her followers looked to her with fear and expectation. She knew what they wanted her to say, that they would stand together and triumph, that their courage would be enough. But she did not lie. She stood before them, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering, and told them the truth. The enemy is stronger than us. They have more weapons, more men, more power. If we face them head-on, we may not survive. But we are not powerless. We are not broken. We know these lands better than they do. We know how to endure. If we fight not with fear but with cunning, we can bring them down piece by piece, until even the strongest among them cannot stand. I will not promise victory, but I will promise this: I will fight with you, I will bleed with you, and I will never leave you. Her words were simple, but they lit a fire among those who heard them. They cheered not because she promised them safety, but because she stood beside them in truth. That night, as the fires burned low, she walked the camp and saw the people sleeping close together, drawing strength from one another. She felt the ache of exhaustion in her bones, the scars of countless battles pulling at her skin, but she also felt a strange peace. For the first time, she was not fighting for her own survival alone. She was part of something larger, something worth dying for. And though the storm of war loomed closer with each passing hour, she knew she would face it without fear. At dawn, scouts returned with urgent news. The warlord's army was less than 2 days away. The air grew heavy with dread, But Rhea stood tall, her fists tightening, her breath steady. The time had come to finish what she had begun. The morning of the second day rose gray and cold, the air thick with anticipation as if the earth itself held its breath. From the highest ridge near the camp, Rhea stood watching the horizon, her eyes narrowing as she caught the first glimmer of movement in the distance. The warlord's forces stretched like a dark river, banners fluttering, weapons gleaming beneath the pale sun. There were hundreds of them, perhaps more, and they marched with the confidence of wolves descending on helpless prey. Behind her, the people she had trained gathered in uneasy silence. Farmers clutching spears, shepherds gripping axes, boys and girls barely old enough to hold a blade, all of them looked to her now. She felt the weight of their faith pressing against her chest, heavier than any chain, and yet it did not crush her. It steadied her. She turned to face them, her voice low but carrying through the crisp air. What comes will test us all. They will come with fury, with fire, with every weapon they know. But remember this, they believe us weak, they believe us broken. They think we will scatter and fall. We will show them they are wrong. We will not meet them head-on. We will strike where they cannot see, vanish where they cannot reach, and bleed them until their strength is gone. Stand together and no power can break us. A murmur of resolve swept through the crowd, not loud but firm, and it was enough. As the sun climbed higher, Rhea led them into the forest that lined the valley, positioning them along narrow trails and hidden ridges. She knew the land would be their ally. Here the enemy's numbers would count for little, their weapons slowed by trees and shadows. Every detail mattered, stones stacked to tumble onto roads, traps hidden in undergrowth, signals whispered from one fighter to the next. They would not win by strength but by patience, precision, and will. The warlord's army entered the valley by midday, their songs of war echoing against the cliffs. At their center rode the warlord himself, his body still scarred from their last encounter, his pride burning hotter than ever. His eyes scanned the treeline, filled with hatred, searching for the woman who had humiliated him. He shouted promises of slaughter to his men, swearing that this time her body would be left for vultures. His voice carried far, but Rhea listened without flinching from her hidden perch. She felt no fear of his words, only the steady beat of her own pulse, reminding her that this moment was the culmination of everything she had endured. The first strike came swiftly. A cart laden with supplies rolled along a narrow pass when a volley of stones crashed down from above, shattering wheels, scattering soldiers. Before they could recover, shadows leapt from the trees, striking hard and vanishing into the undergrowth. Cries of confusion and pain rang out, but when the enemy turned to give chase, they found nothing but silence. Rhea moved among her fighters like a phantom, appearing where the line wavered, striking down an enemy, guiding her people with sharp gestures, always at the front, never asking of them what she would not do herself. Each clash was brief but brutal, leaving the warlord's men rattled, their confidence fraying as they bled without ever grasping their foe. By nightfall, the valley that had once echoed with their marching songs was filled with curses and groans. Fires burned in scattered patches where ambushes had torn through their ranks, and their dead littered the ground. The warlord raged, striking down his own men in fury, vowing that he would not rest until Rhea's head was at his feet. His hatred burned hotter than reason, and in that fire lay his weakness. Rhea knew it. The second day was worse for them. Exhaustion gnawed at the warlord's soldiers, their food supplies dwindled, their morale shattered by the constant, invisible strikes. Yet they pressed on, driven by fear of their master's wrath more than by any true courage. Rhea's people, though weary, grew bolder with each skirmish. They saw that their enemy was not invincible, that courage and cunning could bring giants to their knees. Where once there had been only farmers, there now stood fighters, hardened by necessity and bound by trust in the woman who led them. By the third day the warlord could bear no more. He ordered his men to form a wide sweep through the forest, burning as they went, determined to flush her out. Flames roared, smoke curled into the sky, and the air grew thick with ash. The trap she had set was dangerous, but it was the only way to end this. As the warlord pushed deeper into the forest, chasing phantoms, she waited in the heart of the valley with her strongest fighters. When he broke through the trees roaring with rage, she was there to meet him. He charged like a beast, swinging his massive blade, but she slipped aside, striking at his side, forcing him to turn, to stumble, to bleed. Her fighters clashed with his guards in a storm of steel and fury, the air filled with shouts and screams, the ground slick with sweat and blood. Still, she kept her eyes on him, the monster who had burned villages and crushed innocents beneath his heel. Every strike she landed was for the dead he had left behind, Every block was for the living who now depended on her. The battle raged until the forest itself seemed to tremble. And though he struck with all the fury of his pride, though his men fought with desperation, Rhea did not falter. She had promised her people she would not leave them, and she would keep that promise, even if it cost her life. The clash in the heart of the burning forest became a storm of fire and steel, and yet amid the chaos Rhea felt her focus sharpen into something absolute. The warlord towered before her, his massive blade cutting arcs through the smoke, each swing powerful enough to tear down trees, but she was faster, weaving between the strikes like water slipping past stone. Every movement was honed from years of being underestimated, every blow fueled by the memory of voices that told her she was nothing. Sparks flew as steel scraped rock, as flames licked the branches above, and in the midst of it all her fists found their mark again and again. The warlord's body bore the weight of her defiance, ribs cracking, blood spilling, but still he roared with rage, his pride refusing to let him fall. Around them, her people fought with a desperation that was no longer born of fear but of conviction. Farmers who once knew only the plow now drove spears into armored mercenaries. Shepherds swung axes with the strength of men who had lost families to fire. Each cry of defiance echoed louder than the warlord's roars, and each victory fueled the next. They were not trained soldiers, but they were united, and that unity proved stronger than the greed of the mercenaries who fought only for coin. Slowly the warlord's army began to waver. Men who had come seeking glory now found themselves bleeding in a forest that seemed to fight against them. Their leader's fury could not hide the cracks forming in their resolve. Still, the warlord pressed forward, his hatred for Rhea blinding him to all else. He struck with reckless abandon, and for the first time she felt the weight of his blade graze her arm, tearing flesh and drawing blood. Pain seared through her body, but she clenched her teeth and pressed on, refusing to let it slow her. The sight of her blood only seemed to inflame him further, his laughter booming as though victory was within his grasp. But Rhea had learned long ago that arrogance was the greatest weakness of all. She feigned retreat, letting him believe he had driven her back, his blade carving the air inches from her body. He followed, blinded by triumph, until he stumbled into the clearing where she had led him. There waiting were the traps her people had set, sharpened stakes hidden beneath leaves, ropes rigged to pull down branches heavy with stones. With a sharp cry she signaled, and the forest itself seemed to come alive. The warlord was battered from all sides, his men cut off from reaching him, his pride crumbling as he realized he had been lured into her snare. Yet even wounded, even as his strength faltered, he refused to yield. He hurled his broken body forward, swinging his blade in one last desperate arc. She met him head-on, her fists striking with the fury of every soul he had tormented. The impact shook her bones, but it was enough. His blade fell from his hands, clattering to the ground, and with a final cry he collapsed to his knees. The firelight revealed the truth in his eyes at last. Not hatred, not rage, but fear. The mighty warlord who had promised her death now knelt broken before her. She stood over him, her chest heaving, blood dripping from her wounds, and the forest fell silent as all eyes turned to see what she would do. She could have killed him then, ended his life as he had ended so many others. The thought burned in her mind, and for a heartbeat she wanted nothing more than to strike the final blow. But as she raised her hand, she remembered the villagers who had knelt to her not out of fear but hope, the people who looked to her as proof that cruelty could be defied. Killing him would make her no different from him, a tyrant ruling by fear. With a slow, deliberate breath, she lowered her hand. "Your reign ends here," she said, her voice steady, echoing through the clearing. "But I will not become what you are. You will live, and you will see the strength of those you tried to break." Her people surged forward, binding the warlord in chains, their cries of triumph shaking the forest. The mercenaries who still fought dropped their weapons, seeing their master undone, and many fled into the night. The battle was over. The flames smoldered, the screams faded, and in their place rose the sound of victory. Yet Rhea did not celebrate. She sank to one knee, her body trembling from exhaustion, her wounds burning. She felt hands lift her gently, voices calling her name, and through the haze she saw the faces of those she had fought for, faces filled not with fear but with gratitude and unshakable belief. She had given them more than survival, she had given them the strength to believe they could endure. As dawn broke over the ravaged valley, painting the sky with gold, Rhea stood once more before her people. They had won, but the cost had been high and many had fallen. She looked into their weary eyes and spoke the truth they already knew, that the war was not truly over, that others would rise, that struggle would never vanish entirely. But she also told them this, that they had proven they were not weak, that together they had toppled a monster, and that no one could take that strength from them now. The cheers that rose in answer were not wild but steady, born of resilience rather than fleeting joy. And as she stood among them, bloodied but unbowed, Rhea felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The world would continue to tell her to stand down, to step aside, to leave the battles to others. But she knew now, with every scar on her body, that she would never again bow to those words. She had faced the storm and endured. She had taken down armies with her bare hands. And she was far from finished. The valley bore scars of fire and steel, the earth blackened where flames had devoured trees, the soil soaked with the blood of the fallen, yet amid the wreckage there stood life that refused to bend. The villagers who had survived the long night of battle gathered in silence, mourning the ones they had lost, but their eyes no longer held only grief. They carried a fire now, something that could not be crushed by any tyrant. Rhea walked among them slowly, her body aching, her wounds raw, but her spirit unbroken. Each step felt like walking through fragments of memory, each shattered spear and broken shield reminding her of what it had taken to reach this point. She saw the faces of children who had hidden during the fighting, their wide eyes following her every movement, and in them she recognized the same question she had once carried in her own heart. Can someone who is small, someone who is told to stand down, truly rise? And in her presence they found the answer. When she reached the place where the warlord was bound, chained and silent, she studied him not with hatred but with a deep, steady calm. He had been the embodiment of everything that had tried to keep her beneath its heel, and now he knelt in the dirt, stripped of his pride, his army scattered. She knew some would demand his death, and part of her heart longed for that final closure, but she also knew what his survival meant. Letting him live meant he would carry the humiliation of defeat forever, a scar deeper than any blade. He would see the world grow beyond him, see the people he sought to crush thrive without him, and that would be punishment enough. When she turned away, her people understood her choice, and though some struggled with it, most nodded in solemn agreement. Mercy was not weakness, it was strength greater than vengeance. As the days passed, the village transformed. They buried their dead with honor, planting trees above their graves so that life would rise where life had been taken. They rebuilt homes with their own hands, stronger this time, built not from fear of being destroyed but from belief in their right to endure. The valley echoed with the sound of hammers and saws, of laughter slowly returning to places that had known only silence. Rhea worked alongside them, her hands blistered from carrying wood, her body weary from endless effort, but she refused to place herself above them. She was not a ruler, not a queen, not even a chosen hero. She was one of them, forged by the same fire, scarred by the same struggle, and her place was among them. Still, the whispers spread beyond the valley. Travelers carried tales of the woman who had faced an army barehanded, who had toppled a warlord without yielding, who had given her people hope. In distant towns her name was spoken as a myth, a spark of inspiration for those who lived under oppression. Strangers began arriving, seeking to join the village, to live where freedom had been fought for and won. What had once been a small, hidden valley slowly became a beacon. And with growth came new challenges. Rhea found herself constantly tested, forced to decide not only how to defend what they had built but how to guide it forward. She had never asked for leadership, but it found her, and though she carried it reluctantly, she did not abandon it. In the quiet of the nights, when she sat alone beneath the stars, she thought of the path that had brought her here. She remembered the first time someone had told her to stand down, to leave the fight to others. She remembered the sting of rejection, the ache of believing she was powerless. Those voices still echoed in her mind, but now they were drowned out by the voices of her people singing as they rebuilt, by the laughter of children who would grow up knowing freedom, by the quiet strength she had found within herself. She realized that her story was no longer only her own. It belonged to all those who had been told to kneel, to yield, to silence their fire. It belonged to anyone who had ever been made small by the weight of cruelty. Her victory was not a single battle won in the forest but a legacy that would outlive her. Years later, when her hair had turned silver and her body bore the full toll of the life she had chosen, she still stood at the heart of the valley. She watched the children of those who had once fought by her side grow into leaders themselves, watched the trees planted on graves rise tall and strong, their branches sheltering generations. The scars of the war still marked the land, but they were reminders rather than wounds. She knew then with absolute certainty that the voices which had once told her to stand down had been wrong. The strength to rise had always been within her, and by unleashing it she had changed not only her fate but the fate of countless others. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold, she stood once more in the clearing where she had defeated the warlord. The forest had regrown, the charred earth now rich with life, the air filled with birdsong instead of screams. She placed her hand against the trunk of a tree that had grown from the ashes and closed her eyes. She felt the heartbeat of the land, steady and unyielding, and she smiled. Her journey had been long, her battles unending, but in the end she had proven that no command to stand down could silence a spirit that refused to break. And though her story would one day pass fully into legend, the truth would remain in the earth, in the trees, in the voices of her people. That one woman had stood against the storm, barehanded, and in doing so had taught the world that no one is too small to fight, and no one is ever too broken to rise again. The end.